All right, today we're diving into a really interesting and honestly a deeply personal question for millions of people. What's the best way to show love and respect for the Prophet Muhammad? We're going to explore one very specific viewpoint here, unpacking a really calm, structured argument to see how it's built. So let's get right into it.
You know, when you really get down to it, the whole discussion just boils down to this one question. Is true love and respect something you show with, say, a big yearly celebration? Or is it something else entirely? The viewpoint we're looking at today has a pretty specific answer, and it all starts with how they define love in the first place.
Okay, so here's our game plan for unpacking this argument. First up, what is true love according to the source? Then, who do they point to as the perfect example to follow? After that, we'll get into a really key difference between honoring and celebrating. Then we'll tackle some common objections, and finally, we'll land on the author's big conclusion. All right, so first things first. Before we can even talk about specific actions or, celebrations, the author makes a big point. Everything, and I mean everything, hinges on what we mean by love for God and His prophet. This is basically the foundation for their entire argument.
So this specific verse is where the source says we have to start. The argument is, hey, the ultimate proof of love isn't just a warm feeling inside or something you say. It's an action. It's the act of following. So from this point of view, to love the prophet is to follow his example. And that one idea, it becomes the lens we have to look through for everything else that follows.
Okay, so if the key word is follow, then the next logical question is, well, who do we follow? Whose example is the one that sets the standard? The source text has a very, very specific answer to that. And here's that answer. The source brings up this term, the Salaf, and basically presents them as the gold standard. And the logic is pretty straightforward. These were the first 3 generations of Muslims, the ones closest in time to the Prophet himself. So their understanding and practice is seen as the purest. Their actions, and this is really important, their inactions too, become the main evidence in this whole argument.
And this statement, a hadith from the Prophet, is presented as the core reason why. By saying these first 3 generations are the best, the source argues that their way of doing things, their way of showing love, must also be the best way. It solidifies them as the one true model to follow.
And this brings us to what is probably the most central point of the entire argument. It's a really specific distinction the author makes between 2 different ways of showing love and respect.
So the source draws this really sharp line in the sand between 2 ideas, ihtifa and ihtifal. Ihtifal, or honoring, is presented as something ongoing, something the Prophet himself sanctioned. Think about his weekly fast on Mondays. That's the example given. But ihtifal, or celebrating, is framed as something totally different, an annual festival. And the source claims this was a later invention, something the early Muslims just didn't do.
And this timeline right here really puts that claim into perspective. According to the source, you've got 300 years, the entire era of those gold standard early generations, where there was just no annual birthday celebration. The practice, they say, only pops up as a big yearly thing much, much later, centuries later, with the Fatimid dynasty. Now, of course, you might be thinking, hold on, there are lots of good reasons people give for this celebration. And you're right, the author knows this and actually spends a lot of time addressing those points. So let's walk through how the source responds to some of the most common justifications.
Okay, so here's a big one you hear a lot. Isn't this just a valid scholarly disagreement? You know where different respected scholars have different opinions and you can just follow the one you trust? It's a good question. So how does this author respond to that?
Well, the rebuttal here is basically that not all disagreements are created equal. From this viewpoint, a scholarly opinion, no matter how respected the scholar, isn't considered valid if it goes against what they see as a foundational principle, like, for example, the consensus of those first 3 generations, or what they see as clear warnings against adding new things to the religion.
And that idea leads to this. Honestly, this really fascinating legal principle the author brings up. It's called legislative omission. And the core idea is pretty simple, but powerful. Sometimes what the Prophet and his companions chose not to do is just as important as what they did do. That choice to leave something out is itself a form of guidance. So let's walk through the logic here, step by step. Step 1. Did the reason to celebrate exist? Absolutely. The companions loved the Prophet more than anyone.
Step 2, was there anything stopping them from having a party? Nope, no obstacle. Step 3, and yet, they didn't do it. They omitted the action. So the conclusion, in this view, is that the omission itself is the ruling. The very fact they didn't do it is taken as proof that it's not supposed to be done.
Okay, but what about another huge point? What about all the very respected scholars who came later and did say it was okay? That's a really powerful counterargument, and yeah, the source text tackles it head on.
The response really boils down to a question of hierarchy, or you could say, a pecking order of authority. The source argues that the practice of the Salaf, those early generations, is foundational. It's the binding precedent. So while the opinions of later scholars are absolutely respected, they're seen as secondary. And if a later opinion seems to go against the unanimous practice of those first generations, well, this viewpoint insists that the original example has to win out. It takes priority. So, after all that, where do we land? After building the case and dealing with the objections, what's the author's final takeaway? According to this specific argument, what is the right way to channel all that love and respect?
Well, the conclusion kicks off with a really simple, stark number: 2. The argument is that in Islam, there are only 2 divinely legislated annual festivals, or Eids, period. So from this perspective, creating a third annual event, even if you have the absolute best intentions, is framed as a religious innovation. It's seen as adding something new to the faith that wasn't there before. So the author isn't saying the desire to honor the prophet is wrong, not at all. They're saying that desire is absolutely correct, but it has to be channeled into things the prophet himself actually did. So instead of one big party a year, the alternative proposed here is something consistent, something weekly, like fasting on Mondays the day he was born. And more than that, a deep, lifelong commitment to following his entire path. In this quote from the classical scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, which the source uses, it just perfectly wraps up the whole argument. It says, the perfection of love isn't found in a festival. It's found in following him, obeying him, and bringing his ways to life in everything you do. It's about a deep, total commitment to his path.
And that really leaves us with a final, bigger question, doesn't it? If you step back from this specific topic and just think about any historical figure, a mentor, maybe even your own parents, what does it truly mean to follow their example? Is it more about celebrating one special day for them, or is it about trying to live by their principles every single day? It's a question right at the heart of how we all choose to honor the people and the ideas that matter most to us.